Number 1. First beer. My grandmother had a lot of kids, and I was the son of the oldest daughter. She actually had a couple of sons who were only a few years older than I was. So even though we lived in a different state, whenever we visited the grandparents, I was more like a brother with my uncles than I was a nephew. I always wanted to do everything with them, and as the adults really didn't want to bother with us too much, they had no problem with that. There were some things that my uncles, Jeb and Carl, did that I didn't like. I mean, they chewed tobacco or snuff ever since I could remember. I think I tried it once and ended up throwing up right away. To this day, I don't really understand why some people enjoy doing that. But when I was 14 years old and visiting them, and they had some beer, for the record, they were 17 and 15 respectively at the time, it wasn't something that I turned down. And no, I didn't like the taste of it right away. However, I did want to get drunk with my uncles, so I was able to easily overlook that. My grandpa knew that they drank beer and didn't care. However, if my mom had found out that I was drinking it, especially at 14 years old, there would have been a lot of hell to pay for quite a few people. So we decided to do it out of the house. That meant jumping into Jeb's pickup truck and then driving through the hills. This was the 1970s, which doesn't excuse driving drunk, but in areas like that, young guys drinking beers and driving around in their trucks in the country was not an unusual thing. The first time I tried that was at 14 and happened during the fall. I hadn't expected the chance to actually go drinking, but I was really excited when they mentioned it. Jeb and Carl told my parents that they were going to take me over to a friend's house and would be back much later. No one really even thought about it, and it wasn't really a lie either, because they were going to go and pick up another guy friend of theirs too. By the time that my uncles picked up their friend, Robbie, his little brother, who was my age, decided to tag along as well. That was fine because the little brother and I could ride in the bed of the truck, but with Robbie up front. They had one of those windows on the back of the cab that slid open, so we could chat if we needed to, and we could hand them a beer, since the cooler was in the back with us. This was in the Appalachian area, so there was a lot of hills and country to drive through. It was really crisp and cool outside, and the leaves were also falling pretty hard. It was already dark outside as we were driving around, but we didn't spend the entire time driving around the roads. Occasionally we would stop somewhere, pull off to the side, pull up to the side of a hill, and look over the side while playing music and just drinking and talking. I'll always remember this night for many different reasons. I mean, it's obvious that most people remember the first time they ever had a beer, and the first time that they'd ever gotten drunk. And I was experiencing both of these things on that very night. But I remember it well, too, for a completely different reason. I had been out on rides with my uncles before on non-drinking days, so I knew what to expect. It was driving on twisting, dark, graveled roads that were only wide enough for one vehicle to drive on. You had to be careful in the back of the truck because occasionally a small branch from a tree might be stretched over and slap you upside the face. It didn't really matter much that the roads were so thin, though, because you very rarely, if ever, came across another vehicle on those roads. At one point, we found a nice area to pull over in. There was like a little bit of a grassy area on the side of the road that looked pretty perfect, so we pulled over there and my uncles shut the truck off. For a while, the five of us just sat in the truck, drinking and hanging out, having a really good time. Now, even though it was my first time drinking, I was really going slow enough to not get sloshed out of my mind, so I was able to somewhat keep my wits around me. We were sitting in the dark when Robbie began mentioning seeing some lights off in the woods. His brother and I really didn't notice them at first or even try to notice them, but eventually he made us look out there and keep looking. And eventually, yeah, we saw some moving lights out in the woods. My uncles and Robbie all wanted to go out in the woods to check out what the lights were. Me and the brother, however, didn't want to. We let them do it while we just remained in the truck, drinking and talking. We didn't think too much about them going off and checking out the lights, because at the most, it might have just been some hunters, out late at night or something like that. It wasn't anything we were worried about. I don't know how long it was, but after a while, the three of them came running back to the truck. The brother and I didn't really think anything was wrong at first, until they started getting into the truck. Looking in through the cab window, though, we noticed that Robbie was injured. He was bleeding and holding something up against a wound. "What the hell happened?" the brother asked my uncles. "There were these two really freaky-looking guys out there in the woods," Carl began telling us. "They looked like they were out hunting or something, so we were wondering what sort of hunting they were doing. When we got too close to them, one of them took a hunting knife and then stabbed Robbie with it, so we just grabbed him and ran away with him as quickly as we could." I can't say I really believed it at first. I almost thought my uncles were playing some sort of prank on us. It was the sort of thing that they would have done, and by the pure fact that Jeb didn't start the truck right away, and he let Carl explain what was going on, made me believe that even more. I thought if they were as scared as they were saying that they were, that the very first thing that would have happened would have been them starting the truck up. I also might be misremembering what was going on because I was pretty tipsy for the first time in my life. I do remember Jeb starting the truck up then, and then trying to turn it around so we could head back down the direction on the road that we had come from. It took him a few moments to get himself turned around before pulling out. Still thinking it might have been some sort of prank, I looked back towards the trees. Although all I had to see were the red lights on the back of the truck, I was able to see something that sticks in my memory to this day, decades later. Two of the biggest and weirdest looking men I had ever seen came out of the woods, making their way toward us. It was really weird that they weren't moving very fast, though, as if they had some problems running or something like that. But they looked like something out of the movie The Hills Have Eyes or Mad Max or something. Just utterly horrifying looking men. I yelled at Jeb to get the hell out of there as quickly as he could. There really wasn't a whole lot of space between them and the tailgate of the truck before Jeb got all turned around and then began to drive. I honestly thought the two men were going to get to the tailgate and get into the truck. Robbie's brother and I were terrified, screaming at Jeb to head out, and he did. We got out of there, and it was a terrifying ride from then on. It was dark and we were drunk and scared and didn't know what had happened. The two of us definitely didn't want to be in the bed of the truck for the ride back, but there wasn't anything that we could do about that. We had to put up with it as we drove back. Rather than go to a hospital or anything, they drove right down to Robbie's house. They didn't want to drive into town drunk and figured it would be best if Robbie's parents drove him to the town themselves. Once it was just me and my uncles again, we didn't drive back right away. They needed to have a few beers again to calm down. And of course at that point I was back in the cab of the truck. Hell, there was no way I was going to be in the bed anymore, but it was still hard to calm down after everything that happened. My uncles insisted that there were some weird-ass people out in the hills, but they still seemed like something out of a horror movie. Robbie turned out to be okay, except eventually having an ugly scar that was just as bad as the emotional ones we got that night. Number 2. Video Night. Often during the hot summers of the mid and late 80s, I would spend some time at my cousin's house. We both lived in rural areas, but staying with his family was considerably better than staying with mine. My cousin Clay and I had a lot in common, and we would do a lot of fun things in the summer. We would watch scary movies on VHS, play one-on-one baseball, go hiking in the woods. Hell, my aunt even had a really old typewriter, and the two of us would write really bad horror stories. My uncle and aunt both worked evening jobs, so they weren't there at night. My uncle was a park ranger, and my aunt was the manager of the grocery store. So we had supervision during the day if we were home at the time. We usually weren't except at meal times, though. But at night, we normally stayed in and watched videos or did something like that. We rarely, if ever, would go out and do anything at nighttime. The area that he lived in was very safe, so if we did, we never really had anything to worry about. I wouldn't say, though, that the area they lived in was an area where everyone knew each other, however. In town, that would be a much different story. Whenever we went to town, whether it was to go to the store or go to the swimming pool, everyone seemed to know each other. But out of the house, it was completely different. This was a Saturday night. We were going to be home by ourselves for quite a long time. We had a fun ride in the back of my uncle's pickup truck into town to rent movies and get us some candy and soda. It was nearly an hour ride from the town to the house in the country, and we always enjoyed being in the bed of the truck when it happened. It was still light outside when both of Clay's parents went to work, so the two of us decided to go for a walk down the road for a while. I don't really remember too much about that, but then we got home and decided to have some snacks and watch movies. Being summer, it was still light outside for quite a while, and while we were sitting in the living room watching a movie, we noticed something. A truck was driving down the road, and it stopped and then turned into the driveway. Clay didn't recognize the truck, and it didn't pull all the way up to the house. So he got up and let me know that he was going to go outside and see who it was. Clay walked out the front door and onto the porch. As soon as he opened the door, though, I watched as the truck went in reverse, and it began pulling out of the driveway. It pulled out and then it went back on the road, heading off in the direction that it had come. Clay came back inside, and then we both decided that it was just someone that was using the driveway to turn around. We kept watching the movie and didn't pay any more mind to it. The night went on, and the sun eventually went down. Clay and I kept watching movies, and since we were relatively young, we were truly getting scared from watching them. But of course, boys our age were not going to admit such a thing. A little bit later, we heard some noise outside. We also saw some lights shining through the front windows of the house. We both got up and went over to the window, looking out the window. It was dark enough outside, and the lights were shining right into the house, but we couldn't make out what the vehicle was. However, it didn't pull up any closer to the house than the pickup truck from earlier had, so we began talking to each other about whether or not it might have been the same truck. We expected the truck to just pull out and turn around, much like the truck from earlier did. But that didn't happen right away. In fact, nothing actually happened right away. The truck just remained in place, with a light shining into the house. Clay was about to go out on the porch, but for some reason I stopped him. Something was making me feel really uneasy about what was going on. Hell, I didn't know what was going on, but it just felt weird to me. This was an area where people never locked their doors, whether it was during the day or even while they were sleeping, so he didn't think that anything was wrong. But the very fact that the truck just kept sitting there was really bugging me, and I just knew somewhere deep inside that it wasn't right. Lock the door, I told him to do. He hesitated, but went over to the door and locked it. He asked me what I thought was going on, but I didn't know, and I told him that. I just told him something felt wrong. We stood there for a while, looking out the windows, wondering what was going to happen. Since Clay's parents were both gone, there weren't any vehicles in the driveway. but it was obvious that someone was in the home because of the light from the television set. But still, for a while, the vehicle didn't do anything, just sat there. It was suddenly and out of nowhere that we heard a gunshot go off. It was definitely coming from the area around the truck. The two of us got scared, but we didn't drop to the floor like we should have. We ran into his parents' room, and Clay grabbed his dad's rifle. We heard another gunshot after that. Clay was feeling a lot of bravado and wanted to run outside with the rifle, but I convinced him not to. While we were discussing it, though, we noticed something that we hadn't expected. The vehicle began pulling out of the driveway, and then it drove off. Confused, we came out of the room. Nothing was broken, like a window or anything by a bullet. We couldn't figure out what had just happened. Why had a guy shot 2 shots, which obviously did nothing, and then drove away? We checked outside and noticed something on the porch. Someone had dropped what looked like animal entrails onto the porch. We didn't know what to make of it, but we knew that it hadn't been there before, so that guy must have put them there. But we didn't know why. We called Clay's dad, and he eventually came over to the house before his duty was over. He couldn't make any sense out of it either. However, while he was there was a phone call. It had to be an hour after the vehicle left. Apparently all the guy said was that the next time, he wouldn't miss. That was terrifying. It was just a series of really weird events that we guessed had to be a threat against someone. Clay's dad thought that it was meant for him, since he was a ranger and had arrested people for poaching and things like that. But he really wasn't sure, or if he was, he definitely never told us. Number 3. Summer Camp Creep. Back in the mid to early 2000s, I attended summer camp for a few years. One year I made friends with a camper in my cabin named Matthew. He returned the following summer, but was in another cabin, and we also became friends with another camper, Patrick. Swimming was basically a pool party, where the entire camp would gather before getting ready for dinner. During this time we would have private conversation, and Matthew would tell stories, and because they weren't necessarily appropriate for the camp, we were young adults, talking about what young teenage boys talk about when it comes to teenage girls, adult women, and other stuff of that nature. We try to find privacy, though it's often hard, especially when the counselors weren't big on campers wandering off. One day the conversation shifted from the typical naughty teenager stuff to Matthew asking us to help him practically kidnap a girl from her cabin and get her to the river. The plan being similar to burying somebody in sand at the beach. Matthew says they were friends, had a fight over something. The girl won't speak to them, and this would be a prank to get revenge. I'm 50-50 on whether this was a joke, and trying to decide if it was actually a joke, a sick prank he actually planned on going through with, or a murder plot. I seem to remember him mentioning something sick like rape, among stuff he planned to do to her at the river, but memory of this time is getting a little fuzzy. As he swam away, I talked Patrick out of the plan and he backed out. I then used the layout of the cabin as my excuse to not help him. The back door was locked and never used, and the counselors hung out at the front door, having conversation at the picnic table on the side of the cabin. So yeah, impossible to sneak out. I'm not sure how we got caught, as I don't recall him getting caught, but I think Matthew said something weird to this girl. She avoided him, and when we backed out from helping him, he threatened her, and she told on him. Eventually they got suspicious and confronted Matthew, and he melted down and confirmed he was telling tall tales. He then asked to say goodbye to me and Patrick, and the counselors pulled us from dinner. He told us that he's not a young pervert or peeping Tom, he made it all up. Then he started telling us that he started all kinds of arguments at home, etc. At breakfast the next day I asked Patrick about Matthew. They were in the same cabin, and Patrick said his family came and got him, driving from out of state to do so. I never saw Matthew again, and he wasn't allowed to come back. I continued hanging out with Patrick until we went home. I'm not sure what to think of Matthew. I'm hoping he's a healthy man now, with no twisted sick fantasy, if that's even the case here. Was he just making up stories like any other kid, and going way too far? I don't know. But the moral of the story, it's one thing to tell ghost stories around the campfire, or pull a prank on fellow campers like dressing up as Jason Voorhees, but if someone sounds like they're going too far, use your better judgment. You'll never know what their intentions truly are. Hey all, Killer Orange Cat here, getting the Country Wednesday thing started up again. Hope you enjoyed these 3 stories. If you did, give me a like, share the video and leave me a comment. I'll try my best to get back to all the comments as usual. I really liked that first story. Those are some of the stories that I really get into, about the weird things you find out into the woods. So, being somebody that didn't grow up completely in areas like that for a few years, and I had relatives out there, I saw some pretty weird stuff myself too, so I know how it could be. So I hope you enjoyed those. Seems like I get a lot of stories lately where people are talking about drinking and driving and then saying it's not okay. Just want to say I'm happy they're throwing that part in there. Again, if you have a story that you'd like me to read and it's original, please send it to the address in the description. And of course, subscribe and hit the bell to get notifications. If you're already subscribed and haven't hit the bell, you might want to try hitting the bell, because I know some people have told me they haven't been getting notifications. But other than that, don't forget to make sure to check in your closet and check under your bed, because you never know where Killer Orange Cat might be hiding. Good night.